momentarily. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is John Bertot. I'm the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2023-2024 Distinguished Scholar Teacher Lecture Series. In fact, these are like my favorite thing to do. It's really, really fun to hear all the different things that our faculty are up to. The Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award was established in 1978 to recognize tenured faculty members who are committed to and have demonstrated excellence in instruction and in their research efforts. The award is sponsored and administered by the Office of Faculty Affairs on behalf of Provost Valerie Rice, and recipients are selected by prior DST recipients. I'm very pleased and honored on behalf of Provost Rice to recognize Dr. Valerie as one of our newest distinguished scholars. As we will hear more shortly, Dr. Orlando's scholarship encompasses a wide variety of subjects in the areas of literary studies, women's studies, African cinema, and French and Francophone studies, specifically focusing on African and academic literature. In addition to her research, Dr. Orlando has contributed significantly to the university's learning environment, engaging students in the courses she teaches and implementation. Provost Rice and I congratulate Dr. Orlando on this much-deserved award and recognition. It's my pleasure to now introduce Ms. Cohen, Director of the School of Languages, Literatures, and Culture, who will formally introduce Dr. Orlando.
Good afternoon. I am very excited to be here today to listen to Professor Orlando's address and also to celebrate the significant achievement in her career with our colleagues and our students from the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and with everyone else who has come out today, as she is honored by the University of Maryland, as you've just heard, with a Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award. At the same time, I'm also honored and humbled to be standing next to Valerie and to be introducing you to this wonderful scholar and beloved teacher. She's been at Maryland as a member of the French and Francophone Literatures and Cultures faculty since 2006. Prior to her arrival in College Park, she taught at Purdue, Illinois Wesleyan, and Brown, where she earned her PhD in 1996. To date, and I emphasize the to date part because it seems that a new author or edited book is always on the horizon when it comes to Valerie. So to date, she has authored or edited 9 books, primarily focused on women's voices in Francophone literature, cinema, and cultures. In her monographs, by the way, you'll see the names of the most recent ones on the back of your program. So in these monographs, she's pushed intellectual boundaries and given voice to those often ignored or bypassed in the academic literature. It's no surprise that she's presented her research to audiences around the world at conferences, symposia, and invited talks that numbered in the hundreds. But being a distinguished scholar is only one part of the secret formula to being designated as a distinguished scholar and teacher. Professor Orlando smoothly integrates her provocative and exciting research into compelling courses for undergrad and grad students alike, and has served as an advisor for countless students, leading and mentoring them to successful academic and non-academic careers. Reading the enthusiastic praise from students on the course evaluation is a potent antidote to any nagging worries of, we just aren't reaching our students anymore, or they're not interested in what we're teaching. It can also be a little depressing if you at the same time got reviews that weren't quite so glowing, but congratulations to Professor Orlando. Students are unanimous in their glowing reviews of what she teaches, whom she teaches, and how she teaches. Many gratefully acknowledge the constructive feedback she has provided them and how it has helped them grow in their academic and subsequent professional careers. She's also shared her boundary-pushing research and distinctive pedagogical style with students in other countries, most notably and recently in France as a Fulbright Tocqueville Distinguished Chair Award recipient at l'Université Lumière Lyon 2 in France in 2019. While there, she introduced second and third year French, I mean French, as in French nationals or living and residing in French, literature students to Francophone works from the Maghreb and the Caribbean, a literature that they never even knew existed. Professor Orlando's talk today will also address the question of connections across the Francophone world. So without further ado, let's pass the podium to Professor Orlando as she regales us with her talk, The Importance of Connections and Relations in the African and Caribbean Tout-Monde, a Literary World of French Expression.
Okay, I'm going to use a microphone because my voice doesn't carry as well as Mel's, and I just am getting over a really bad cold, so I lost my voice last week. But I will start off by thanking Dr. Tout-Monde and Mel Scullin for their nice introductions, and also there are a few other people that I want to thank. And I also want to just mention that I would really like to honor Professor Loretta Clow, who recently died. She was a beloved person and supporter of my work in the SLLC, the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. So I'd like to honor her today with this talk because I think she really would have enjoyed listening to it. We talked about my work a lot over the years. I'd also like to thank Provost Jennifer Rice and her office for the award. And I'd also like to recognize the University of Maryland for its commitment to the humanities and to humanist ideals that are so under threat these days in our country. UMD really stands behind the humanities, supporting professors who feel increasingly under attack in our country simply for trying to do our jobs. That is to teach students how to think beyond their borders in other languages and regions of the world, and also teaching them about our own backyard. UMD, I think, recognizes the importance of the subject of my talk today. That is the importance of communication and exchange and circulation in what we're calling the Tout-Monde in French, which is roughly translated as the all or the we world. Equally, I'd like to thank Doctors Andrea Frisch and Mary Ellen Scullin for initially proposing my dossier to the DST Award and doing the legwork that it took to compile it. Dean Schoeniken, I also would like to thank for her letter of support, writing it right after she arrived on our campus, not even knowing me. I'd also like to thank Brenda Mehta and Logan Connors, colleagues out in the wider French studies world who wrote letters. Professor Cécile Astelin for being such a supportive friend and colleague over the years. Emeriti Sanda Cyprus, who gave feedback on this presentation. And I'd also like to thank all my colleagues in SLLC for the years of fruitful dialogue and exchange. I had students write letters. Razan Mikdashi, an undergraduate student who took French 242 a few years ago. And I'd also like to thank all of my French 242 students that are here today in the audience. I programmed this talk during class so that they could come. But I appreciate their insightful comments. A lot of the things that I'm going to discuss today came out of this class that I teach in the general education program. And most of the students are not literary in our who are in literary studies. So a lot of the issues that come up and have fueled my research have come really from their ideas about literature and reading it for the first time. See if this works. Good. For years, my books, articles, and chapters in edited volumes, I have sought to explore my students' way of looking in and through what we call in French la littérature monde, or world literature in French. And this is what I'm going to speak about today. Over the course of my entire career, I have explored Francophone literature in order to understand perspectives, connections, and ideas that can be forged from one end of the globe to the other through flows of exchange, or what Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant calls relations, or relations, in the sense of connections that are important in what he defines as le tout-monde, or the all world, or a better translation maybe is the we world, which I'm going to use interchangeably in this talk. As expressed in this quote from Treaty of the All World, Traité du Tout-Monde, he says, quote, "In the Tout-Monde, for the first time, human cultures in their semi-totality are wholly and simultaneously put into contact and reactions of effervescence with one another," end quote. In 1993 and 1997, Glissant published a novel entitled Tout-Monde and an essay entitled Traité du Tout-Monde, Treaty of the All World, in which he described the consequences of globalization. In 2007, Glissant created the Institute of the Tout-Monde, or l'Institut du Tout-Monde, in Paris, which further publicized his notions of relation and the Tout-Monde, two principles of openness. In some, as scholar Charlie Verstraete remarks, quote, "The Tout-Monde quantifies all the differences present in the world." Oops. Influenced by French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who published a philosophical world of literatures, Glissant's inhabitants of the Tout-Monde are global subjects, or what he calls sujets mondiaux, benefiting socioculturally and politically from rhizomatic connections that are made by simply leaving their home environments. The rhizome, as pictured here, is, quote, "made of moving directions. It has neither a beginning nor an end. Movement through a rhizome of connections for Glissant is a means for constructing identity, always evolving, always contributing to a subject's becoming." At the end of the 20th century, Glissant's Tout-Monde rhizomatic philosophy of relation contributed to a literary theoretical framework for thinking about a world and a body of literature made in it, and emerging from motion and encounters, thus exemplifying the importance of free circulation and exchange. He said once, quote, "The rallying of the Tout-Monde is partly at the root of literatures of relation," end quote. The Tout-Monde is un monde qui fait bouger choses et gens, a world that makes things and people move. Now, almost 30 years, 18 of which have been at UMD after grad school, I have worked on assessing the connections, the mise en contact, the flow of literary production as framed by Glissant in the world of authors who use French to express and describe their environments. The geographical francophonie, and my students will recognize this because this was on their midterm, a label fraught geopolitically, culturally, and linguistically with pros and cons. A story for another presentation, nevertheless presents a multiply faceted world that includes North and West Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of South America, French Guiana, for example, and the Indian Ocean, La Réunion, French Polynesia, and Canada, of course, and also France, which we include in La Francophonie. During COVID, I was reminded as to how much flow, connections, and circulation and exchange are important to these authors of the French-speaking world, and to what extent movement profoundly forms my identity as a scholar and instructor of this literary world. During the pandemic, when nothing was flowing, travel was forbidden, and my rhizome of connections and exchanges across borders through cultures and languages was practically at a standstill, I wondered how I would, for example, engage with Haitian author Louise-Philippe d'Alembert, who writes stories that take place across multiple countries, regions, languages, and time periods, or Moroccan Leila Slimani, who writes stories inspired by moving between Morocco and France, and Abu Wabari, who spends time between France, Africa, and the US. He teaches at GWU, setting his narratives in diverse regions, countries, and languages, and how they would fare in our lockdown world in stasis. This situation led me to wonder what I would become as a scholar who also depends on travel and flow, circulation among multiple countries, regions, and languages to engage with these authors. My work, you see, is defined by free-flowing movement. In December 2019, right before the world imploded in COVID, I had attended 2 conferences back-to-back, one in Ireland and the other in Fez, Morocco. I had literally woken up in Dublin and went to bed that night in Fez. In February 2020, I wondered if I would ever do that sort of travel again. In short, during COVID lockdown, I experienced a crisis of identity as a scholar of Francophone literatures dependent on going places I write about. Being in stasis, like the authors on whom I focus my research, made me think a lot about dependence on traveling, moving, engaging with people and places throughout the French-speaking Tout-Monde, the all world. Would I ever be able to take a plane again? Now, of course, I was not alone in facing this crisis. Most of the professors on this campus, no matter their discipline, depend on moving, traveling through the air to continents, regions, and cities in the 4 corners of our globe. Stasis, though, made me think a lot about the power of movement, how this power is defined and by whom. I thought about how much movement is a free, unfettered privilege for some, but for others it comes about because of tragedy, forced decisions against one's will, be they economic, environmental, and/or political. This fact is more salient every day. Free movement, that is, movement that comes about not because of forced immigration due to climate change, war, or economics, is indeed a privileged mode of being. That is to say, I belong to the class where movement is for those who can enjoy it, those with valid passports, visas, and money. Indeed, this is one of the primary themes in Guadalupe and Maryse Condé's 21st century novels, Les Belles Ténébreuses and Le Fabuleux et Triste Destin de Yvan et Ivana. You have the translations of the titles there. In these novels, she explores what it means to be a global subject. This world is ideal for some of her characters, benefiting from the positive relations or connections that Glissant defines, as they are able to take advantage of the goods and exchanges as made possible in movement and circulation. However, for most, connections like these are impossible. Most of her characters are severely socioeconomically hampered, stagnant, and even have few opportunities to go elsewhere. The young people depicted in both these narratives are caught in the immense hindrances and challenges of global capitalism, Western neoliberal practices and systems, and the general culture of fear that characterizes our post-9/11 world. And now I can say pandemic world. These challenges are particularly burdensome for young men and women of color, as Kassem in Les Belles Ténébreuses and Yvan and Ivana in Le Fabuleux et Triste Destin demonstrate. They face the unjust practices of the everyday in Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa that play out in societies along lines of color, gender, class, and access or not to power. Assessing the flows of people with passports, Kassem in Les Belles Ténébreuses, working in a hotel in an unnamed African country, remarks how easy it is for the white Europeans, quote, Swedes, Danish, Finns, Germans, and Americans, the pure natives of nationalities with hard currency and weak sun, can easily arrive to underdeveloped countries to exploit and profit from the poor, end quote. Although free circulation, movement by choice in the case for a chosen few, not only myself, but most of the cosmopolitan authors, journalists, filmmakers, academics, and intellectuals of French expression on whom and with I work, These creatives also do not take this movement for granted. They are also always moving, writing, producing for those who cannot. For the people, societies, cultures, and groups who they have had to leave behind in home countries, often plagued by the calamities I just mentioned, they are still voicing and working to improve their situations. None of these texts are written just for what we say in French, divertissement, or amusement. For, you see, Francophone literature is always conceptualized in the sense of what French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre defined as la littérature engagée, a literature that is committed to the socio-cultural, political, and historically deep-rooted questions and issues that need to be asked, analyzed, and understood, not only by writers and artists, but also by the politicians who devise the political structures in the countries from which they have emerged. They ask questions that are pertinent to our wider common humanity. So what is this littérature monde in the 21st century, you ask? Littérature monde is a tout-monde. Glissant's friends and tout-mondistes in the literary world in French, Michel Lebris and Jean Rouault, published the volume Pour une littérature monde for world literature in French in 2007 to highlight contemporary authors en relation, or in connection, and how they evoke, quote, quoting Lebris, a very ununiform world that explores the human condition as sustained by the necessity of moving, of displacement and exile, end quote. This world is one of a new, noisy, colorful, mixed literature that explains the world being born in French. Within French world writing, authors explore how the French language, as it struggles to emerge from colonial legacies, can be refashioned to express the 21st century realities of formerly colonized people. Their work encourages thinking about the socio-political and cultural revelations that are possible through text, that are not rooted within national borders, one national ethos, or a single identity. They make us aware of the necessity of thinking through connections rhizomatically that traverse the theirs and the heres, or what we say in French, les ailleurs et les ici, of our cultural and global environments. Underscoring the recognition in 2007, Congolese author Alain Mabanko writes that, quote, to be a Francophone writer is to be a repository of cultures, a whirlwind of universes. These authors, writing in French, expand narrative encounters across the globe, as well as explore all genres and all types. For example, Algerian Sherif Arbouz writes science fiction, exploring foreign future worlds. Djiboutian Abdou Wabari proposes new utopic models for Africa. And Moroccan Kabir Ami pulls readers into a history where it is Moroccans who beat the Spanish in the discovery of the New World. Côte d'Ivoirian Véronique Tajot, En compagnie des hommes, which she published in 2017, offers an eco-critical narrative of the Ebola virus. And Senegalese Mohamed Sarr, who won the 2021 Prix Goncourt prized novel, La plus secrète mémoire des hommes from 2021, offers us a detective novel of sorts, which involves African authors from the past to the present. These are just a few of the many authors whose origins are in Africa, North and Sub-Saharan, but whose millennial narratives are situated in the world. These novels span the evolution of the first 20 years of the 21st century, revealing the continuous processes of plotting the ever-evolving discourses of being, identity, and modes of language that will help us navigate the challenges of our present time. Writers from the French-speaking world make us all voyageurs, or travelers, through narratives touting what seems the positivity of mobility in a tout-monde, where all sorts of connections are possible. But positivity can only come if we recognize and acknowledge the pain of the past, much of what still lingers and haunts us. In Éloge de la créolité, or Éloge I always forget, In Praise of Creoleness in English, which was published in 1989, Caribbean authors and philosophers Jean Bernabé, Patrick Chamoiseau, and Raphael Confiant further celebrated their compatriot Edouard Glissant's mapping of the multiple, creolized, diverse world that presented to Caribbean people a way of looking at their history through multiple spatio-temporal lenses. They write, "Our history is a braid of stories. We have tasted all languages, all dialects. We are the same, at the same time, Europe, Africa, nourished by Asian, Levantine, Indian, and we also recognize the legacies of pre-Columbian America. Créolité is the diffracted but recomposed world, a maelstream of signified in a single signifier, a totality," end quote. For Chamoiseau and his compatriots, history as expressed in French in the world of writing had to be understood as a process of bearing and taking ownership of the horrors of colonialism, slavery, and the legacies of these facts and contexts, as well as to celebrate the diversity that has come about because of this tragic past. These Caribbean philosophers nuanced Glissant's Tout-Monde, stating that a braided world of positives and negatives means it will always have two faces, coexisting in the present, the possible utopian of the future and the tragic of the past. They point out that Glissant's book, Tout-Monde, published in 1993, does explain that yes, this world is a world making things and people move, literally and figuratively, but it also is constantly documenting atrocities from the past, generating roadmaps for understanding, and explaining the challenges and tragedies of slavery, forced immigration, migration, racism, gender bias, and classism. Emphasizing the painful tragic, as well as the joyful multidimensionality of these authors' Tout-Monde, Guadeloupean writer Simon Schwarz-Barth affirms, quote, "We are the fruit of the meeting of the worlds, geographically and historically, violent encounters, but encounters all the same. We are on the move," end quote. Although their stories are often rooted in the countries from which they come, these authors also thematically explore the displacement and alterity found in exiled places and spaces that are not their own, but that are shared nevertheless by us all. To analyze novels thematically over the years, I have tried to devise a theoretical framework for reading authors' contributions to the we worlds as they present their home stories and those of others. African and Caribbean philosophers, as well as post-colonial theorists, explaining movement and displacement, have helped me explain theoretically, philosophically, and literarily the connections that can be made among pasts and presents, histories and geographies, and sociocultural and political spheres. In addition to Edouard Glissant's Tout-Monde concept, Cameroonian political scholar and historian and a philosopher, he wears many hats, Achille Mbembe's ideas about Afropolitanism, Senegalese philosopher Felwine Sarr's concept of Afrotopia, and anthropologist, globalization scholar Arjun Appadurai's concept of the world in motion are foundational concepts that have helped me over the years analytically flesh out the unique narrative spaces of authors of French expression as they express the themes and concerns of contemporary Africa and the Caribbean. Mbembe's Afropolitanism and Sarr's Afrotopia seek to counter what Sarr notes is, quote, the vulgate of Afro-pessimism that since the beginning of the 1960s has beleaguered post-colonial countries that have continued to face challenges under the West's yoke of essentializing stereotypes. That is, telling Africans, and he really notes this, that the continent was mal parti, à la dérive, had started off badly and was destined to always be out of control, end quote. These two philosophers have sought in their work to contextualize Africa as an interior and exterior mobile space through which creatives, authors, journalists, authors, intellectuals express their views to their people in order to understand the continent as a dynamic geographical platform of exchange. As Mbembe remarks, quote, Africa is intensifying its mobilities and developing its interconnections among spaces that are deconstructing old geographical borders dating from the colonial era, end quote. Writing in the 2000s, Tunisian author and journalist Abdelaziz Belkhoja and Djiboutian writer Abu Waberi imagine innovative what-ifs that postulate new scripts for the Afropolitan landscape, described by Mbembe and Sarr. Africa as an El Dorado was also the subject of a popular film from 2007 called Africa as Paradise, directed by Sylvestre Amoussou from Benin. Belkhoja's Le Retour de l'Éléphant, or The Return of the Elephant from 2003, and Waberi's Aux États-Unis d'Afrique, The United States of Africa from 2006, offer exemplary cosmopolitan narratives that demonstrate an imagined world of other and othered spaces and places possible for Africa and the West. Waberi turns the African continent into the powerful United States of Africa, which dominates socio-politically and culturally the international landscape, leaving the impoverished West, particularly Europe, to fend for itself. In the novel, the poor, white, destitute masses of illegal immigrants coming from Europe wash up on the shores of the golden continent, trying to find employment. Waberi spins a tale that reverses history, where Africa is recognized for the intellectuals, scientists, businessmen, and women, and artists contributing to its greatness. A similar narrative in Belkhoja's Le Retour de l'Éléphant overturns the West's habitual stereotypical view of the, quote, Arab East as depraved society, end quote, to posit, quote, Arabs as the fortunate of history, rich from oil revenues and investment in vast cultural enterprises, end quote. In the year 2103, world order has been turned upside down. It is now destitute Westerners, particularly Americans, like John from the US, who must immigrate to Carthage with one suitcase, seeking education and hopefully new fortunes to escape the socioeconomic poverty of his North American society. The great Roman city of the ancient past has been resurrected in the future as the great Republic of Carthage, a technologically advanced urban megatropolis known throughout the world for its fortunes made through innovations in solar energy and reverse osmosis that have given it inexhaustible sources of electricity and clean water. Both novels present North and Sub-Saharan Africa as centers of civilization, culture, and economic stability. Africa is a continent on which, as Waberi writes, l'homme d'Afrique s'est senti très vite sûr de lui. The African very quickly was sure of himself. The utopic African views expressed in these novels of the 2000s, early 2000s, so up to about 2008, reveal the Afropolitan subject as dependent on what Arjun Appadurai describes as the world in motion, defined by, quote, global forces that set in motion objects, persons, images, and discourses that have different speeds, axes, points of origin and termination, and varied relationships to institutional structures, end quote. Yet for all the riches emerging from all things transnational in Belhoja's and Wabery's 21st century novels, Côte d'Ivoirian Véronique Tajot's later novel from 2017, En compagnie des hommes, in this novel, we are reminded to what extent a world in motion can be dangerous for humankind. Her 2017 novel reveals that our recent globalized deadly virus of COVID-19 had its precursor, Ebola. As if predicting corona, Tajot, in an interview in 2018, noted that, quote, the exploitation of the forest brings upon us not only an unbalancing of flora and fauna, but also new human viruses, end quote. The author's prose offers human and ecological commentary on what was then thought to be the deadliest of viruses. Such a virus, the author notes, is unleashed when it feels compelled to, quote, be in the company of men, end quote. Viruses emerge because, quote, humankind breaks the chain of existence, end quote. Tajot's narrative continuously shifts through different je, or I, narrators who tell the story of Ebola. Determining which country is the focus of her narrative remains elusive because she wants us to understand that this vast virus, its singular, all-encompassing nature, is always going to have its own domain until it emerges and seeks again new connections out of the depths of the African forest, as it did beginning in the 1970s. In the 2000s, specifically from 2014 to 2016, Ebola traveled across West Africa, afflicting Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. The multiple selves, or protagonists, of Tajot's novel take many forms. The first is l'arbre à parole, the tree of words, the voice of a baobab tree, observing the initial incursion into and destruction of natural resources by humankind, which inevitably unleashed Ebola from its dormancy. Quote, I am the baobab, first tree, eternal tree, symbol tree, end quote. This singular tree of Africa, it only grows there, remarks that under her own branches, destruction is occurring at the hands of men. And I quote, wherever they are, they attack the forest. Our trunks crash in a thunderous noise. Our bare roots mourn the end of our dreams, end quote. The multiple perspectives of Tajot's novel progress through rhizomatic connections, building their stories, forming a chain through different chapters, from the baobab to a doctor, a nurse, a grave digger, a mother, a son, a government official, an NGO volunteer, a grandmother, the Congolese researcher who identified the virus in 1976, a couple not yet married who in the end ceased to exist when one of them becomes a victim forced to suffer and then die. In the last chapters, the je telling the story is the Ebola virus itself. The virus reveals to us that it was content on its own, living in the dark recesses of the forest for thousands of years without relation or connections, until it was awakened by men. Quote, it is not me that men should be afraid of. They should be afraid of themselves. I am a 1,000-year-old virus. I was there for a long time, in this extraordinary forest called primary, and where everything remained as it was in a permanent time, end quote. In Tajot's leveling, eco-critical novel, Ebola and humankind are equally linked to systems, both natural and man-made, coexisting in a world in motion where multiple outcomes are possible, both good and bad. The virus lays before us a lesson, reminding readers to what extent we are now victims of our own refusal to understand nature and the role we humans play in maintaining the fragile equilibrium of our planet. For Tajo, we have forgotten our connections with plants and animals. The baobab tree reminds us of the importance of the mutual respect between beings on our planet that should have remained in balance. The questions and challenges as humans Tajo compels us to understand echo back in time to the great Martinican poet Aimé Césaire. So all of you in my class should be waking up right now because you've read him. Aimé Césaire's 1955 affirmations made in his Discours sur le colonialisme, which, by the way, we're reading in a couple of weeks, about capitalist decadent systems that act as contagion, fueling conquest and colonialism. Like Tajo's novel about human viruses and the increasing dangers occurring with unchecked climate change, Césaire's Discours warned us of another socio-political virus, that of insidious colonialism and its degradation. He places us before an abyss. We are on a precipice where we must all make a collective choice. Quote, "L'heure est arrivée, l'avenir du monde est à nous. Qu'allons-nous faire? The hour has come, the future of the world is ours. What will we do?" Both Césaire and Tajo, at two different moments in our collective history, evoke the urgency of a collective need to do something, of looking beyond existing models to explore the ailleurs, the elsewheres, that could provide possible answers or new ways of doing things in our heres, nos ici, of the present. Though these heres and theirs, as Waberry remarks in 2015, through these heres and theirs, as Waberry remarks in 2015 in his La Divine Chanson, we must also realize that, quote, each being exists not only in himself, but also in relation to other beings, end quote. So in conclusion, I'd just like to emphasize that these novels and themes and the lessons they set before us harken back to a series of questions, again, I always come back to Sartre. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre asked in 1948 in his Qu'est-ce que la littérature? What is literature? What is a literary work? If you remember this, students, I asked you this question the first day of class. What is a literary work? And what is the responsibility of an author? In the case of these mentioned here, these questions can be expanded to what is the African and Caribbean author's responsibility to his, her, their past, present, and future as documented and imagined in the Tout-Monde, or the we world? What is the responsibility of the reader who reads their novels? As reader first and foremost, these authors and their Tout-Monde of French expression have also helped me analyze my own relationship, my own relation, connections to not only what I do as a scholar and a teacher, but also my own positionality as an Anglophone American white woman, middle-aged now, academic from the US. I myself am ailleurs, elsewhere, all the time when I put myself in relation to these authors' worlds and their texts. Although I am not of their worlds, I share a common language, that of French. Their literature has helped me understand deeply the pain of others, what empathy is possible in my own self, as well as how to understand other histories and ways of looking at the world. Through the opportunities they allow me to take and to voyage or to travel beyond my own borders, I have come to understand myself as well as my own connections to the world. This is the beauty of the Tout-Monde and the literature that comes from it. This is the beauty that I hope I have imparted and will continue to impart to my students for years to come. For each one of them, I hope, the one thing that they will take away from my courses is the importance of ideas, messages, and challenges that are all described in these utopias and dystopias and found on each page of every novel. If I have succeeded in doing this, then I have accomplished my task as a professor. I take to heart Glissant's advice for understanding the importance of these authors and what they can tell us about our all-world or our Tout-Monde. Let us, and this is a quote that I love to quote, let us listen to the cry of the world. Let's ignore the obligations and pettiness of each day. Let us procession to these writers, far from their homes. Let us allow them to bring us a lot, helping us to weave this network in the Tout-Monde. Thank you. So if you have questions, students, if you have questions. Yes, Andrew?
So earlier you mentioned how like COVID caused you to travel and stuff, like how you like because you write about the places that you go to. What is there any sort of inspiration that you gathered from that experience that influences the way you write now? And does it like change the way that you read stuff from our history?
Very good question. Yes, COVID, I think, changed a lot about how I think and what I think about. And I was in France, and France took COVID very seriously. They literally the government locked us down in our apartments for 55 days. I could not go out without signing a little form, and I only had an hour. I could go out to buy food. And I was by myself. So sitting in an apartment, for 55 days, wondering, I really had a crisis of identity. And I realized how precious it is to be able to take a plane somewhere. And it made me think a lot more. I've always thought about this, but a lot deeper about people who can't move. And we can think about our current situation in the Middle East right now. A lot of people there are over 70 million people right now who are displaced. That was before this current conflict. So it humbles you. I think I'm more humbled than I was before. Although this literature over 30 years has been a very humbling experience, because like I said, none of it is very uplifting. And I told you that the first week, right? None of our stories were going to be very uplifting, because these authors write about the environment in which they're having to live in. Any other questions? Yeah?
Thank you so much, Valerie. What a wonderful presentation. It makes sense that you've gotten to know this year. Amazing how you can go on research and translate it into our students who are. This is so far away, right? Geographically, but what you're doing is you're making it come to the present time and to the present place. So my questions are, I have many questions, but first of all, I think the concept of Tout-Monde is a great one for our college, the College of Arts and Humanities, as we think about all our disparate fields. We are all one. So I'm going to have to think about how we can copyright that. But I wonder if you could talk about, there's many in the room who are much younger and are thinking about where they will go with their research. So I'd love to know, and I don't know this about you, how you came to this place. What was it in undergrad or in high school even that, and I love that you ended the presentation with your positionality. So how did you come to understand how the literatures from other parts of the world could create a more empathetic human being in yourself? When did that start?
Well, I had this whole part, because that was part of the DST. They told us to talk about our own personal trajectory in the beginning. And I had this whole part, But every time I started reading it, I started crying. So I had to take it out because I didn't want to like fall apart. But I have to say that it's really because of my parents. And my parents, my mother was a school teacher. My dad had a PhD in Aramaic and Old Testament religions. And he spoke Hebrew, he spoke some Arabic, you know, so, but he always told me, learn how to type and learn a foreign language and you will always have a job. And and he was totally right. I mean, I always had a job, you know. But also my father, I mean, he had this PhD and he was in universities for a while, but then he went into the Foreign Service and he was posted in Africa for many, many years. And this was after I was in college, but I would go and I would see him, and he worked for not the consulate, but he worked for USIA, which was, I mean, Bush got rid of it, but it used to be America would found libraries and do cultural outreach in countries and have book exchanges and promote authors and intellectuals in the home country to come to the US and have Fulbright exchanges and that kind of thing. And so that's what he did. And he always said, I can't believe, you know, I'm being paid to do this wonderful job of this cultural outreach. And he was the one who really, he gave me my first Heinemann editions of the, you know, published in the 70s, those little red, orange Heinemann classics, which were lots of African, Heinemann did the first translations of a lot of the French writers, but also just promoted a lot of Anglophone African authors too. And he gave me this entire collection when he retired. And so I always had them. Well, actually, I guess he gave them to me before he retired because I had them when I was in grad school. But from early on, I was just very amazed by Africa, you know, and I was very lucky to be able to have traveled there when I was young. You know, I was just early in college, about the age of my students. I went to Liberia, I went to Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, or my father was. So, and yeah, I mean, and always questions of positionality always came up, you know, like my father would, and I would talk about this all the time. So I guess I have him to thank for it. But typing and knowing a foreign language will always get you a job. Students, if you do anything.
And you know, too, that's even more jobs. So come on over to Swiss and we can help you.
Yeah, and so I guess I have to say thanks to my parents. But just, and I grew up in San Francisco also, which is a very diverse place. And I went to, I mean, I thought for a long time growing up in San Francisco, you know, you just think all of America is like San Francisco. And so when you really start living other places, you're amazed at how it's not. But I always was with a lot of diverse people and learning a lot about other people's trajectories and backgrounds, which, you know, was very, very fulfilling. I mean, I look back on it and just am very thankful for it. Any other questions? Yeah, Liz.
This is really interesting. I was struck by all of the sort of metaphors that came up. So, the rhizome,
Yeah.
the Baylock tree, the virus.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what the relationship of those are. What's the relationship of the bottom in terms of what which one brought them all out?
The core one. Yeah, well, you know, of course, in my books, I explain a lot of these concepts much more deeply and theoretically, but I knew that my students would be here, so I didn't want them to fall asleep. So I went very skating over that. But this rise, and on their little handouts, because they're doing some little homework activity. So if those of you came in and didn't get the little homework thing, Anderson has it. But there's a picture of the rhizome. And the rhizome is a root that has no beginning and no end. And I often think about the rhizome actually when I'm walking in France and looking at ferns in the forest, because there are a lot of ferns where I go in the Pyrenees. And these ferns, they just, you know, you can have mountainsides covered with them, and you would never be able to pick out where's the beginning of that fern rhizome and where does it end. And in Glissant's philosophy, this is the underlying current that with all the connections that we have in the world, you know, and I mean, you know, if you think of how COVID spread across the world so fast, I mean, it had its own rhizome. So metaphorically, for me, you know, Anderson asked me that question. I mean, I was thinking about that. Wow, you know, I have a symbolic metaphor, you know, for what I write about, is that you just can never, one history influences another. We don't live in a vacuum. So one history influences another, one's language influences another. I work on French writers of North Africa, but you know, when you read their French, you can tell that the Arabic is always behind it, you know, because it's not the French that you write in France if you're only monolingual. So that's sort of the way it is. And if you think about the baobab tree, they grow upside down, right? So their roots grow. Baobabs, if you've ever seen one, they're amazing. I mean, they're huge, huge trees that grow up, but if you look at them, it looks like they're upside down. So their roots are growing towards the sky. So you don't know, you know, they just grow and grow and grow. I mean, I guess they would grow forever. You know, some of them are hundreds and hundreds of years old. So I guess metaphorically, I work in every text that I read. You can see these, especially in the post-colonial, in our 2000s. That's why I situated the literature in this century. I think we see it more and more of just when you're a citizen of the world, you're from everywhere. You're not rooted in one place. You can't be rooted in one place. As soon as you start doing something, you just start a sort of boule de neige, we say in French, you know, a snowball, and you just keep encountering other ways of understanding and being. That's what being a person is, and evolving as a person. Anything else? Yeah. Hi, Fatima.
There's no book that I can pick up that's speaking on microphone without speaking. I email you and upload it everywhere. So,
I'm a rhizome.
how do you think, with all the work that you've done and the way the field is growing, but also with globalization, where do you think the field is going in the next couple of years to decades in terms of francophone expression, but also like culturally, like people belong everywhere and nowhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking about this a lot in the discipline. Like, you know, what will the next your generation of scholars be looking at? Because even though, I mean, you know, I think we were talking about it the other day in class about, you know, when I was in college, my students' age, I mean, we were typing on typewriters, you know, electric typewriters. We had electric typewriters, but we didn't have internet. We didn't have, you know, we couldn't just look up something, you know, I mean, we had to go physically to the library, flip through the card catalog, find that little piece of paper, you know, get our huge stack of books. I can remember walking home, you know, with these, even in grad school, these huge stacks of books. And we were very balkanized around several really key figures in Francophone studies, these great philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, for one thing, and, you know, reading everything that they wrote. They were sort of the voices of God, you know, but we didn't have the multiple. And the multiple is wonderful, you know, but it's also people there. If you have too much multiple, then you can't hear each other. And I think that's where we are right now. We've got a lot of voices trying to decide where we're going, but they're all competing against each other. And I find it kind of scary for your generation of scholar. I think it's going to be hard to kind of make your path, you know, because of this just huge swath of which is very wonderful in so many ways, but it's also kind of daunting. And so I guess I really don't have an answer. I'm going to have to wait to see how you're sighted in the future when I'm retired. Anything else? So, yes?
So, a lot of the philosophers you mentioned are, of course, male.
Yeah.
And
I thought about that too when I was.
and so, I guess I would like for you to talk about in the context of Tout-Monde, how gender plays out. I know you and I have had long conversations about even when we think of the negative movement.
Right.
You know, decades later, that your colleague from grad school wrote the book about women in the negative movement. So if you can talk a bit about women's role and place, because they're writing the literature, but for many reasons, they're not as centered in the Tout-Monde and these relations.
Yeah, and you know, Glisson was very much faulted for that, and Chamoiseau, and you know, they were very male-centered. You know, they weren't thinking too much about women. Women have always been writing and participating in the dialogue, and I'd have to say, I mean, I don't know, you know, if I started counting really the number of francophone writers, I would say there are probably more women writing than men, but novels. And they're, you know, well, that's why when I teach the Negritude movement, I put in the Nardal sisters, and thank goodness my friend did the translations, because we've only had the translations in the last 20 years, when I guess she did it in early 2000, you know, because they need to be acknowledged. They were the precursors. I mean, Amy Césaire and Senghor got their ideas from the Nardal sisters. But, you know, where are they in the whole history? And simply because women, they were journalists, they didn't have the time either to sit down and write, like, you know, a long poem like Césaire did. They did get to the Sorbonne, but, you know, they had a lot of other challenges. I mean, Suzanne Césaire, for example, you know, she had 5 children, had to take care of Aimée, and also, you know, unfortunately, she got cancer very early on. So we, you know, and died at age 50, I think. So we don't know, you know, what would she have written later. It has, you know, and I think a lot of it for the Francophone context has been dominated by the male perspective because of these huge male philosophers from 1968. And we can talk about that, the date of 1968. Students, I can explain that in our class on Wednesday, why it is so important. But that was when a lot of this kind of fuzzy philosophy was produced. But it was produced by people like Michel Foucault, you know, Derrida, and all these big names. And unfortunately, among them, I mean, there were women, you know, Lucie Irigaray, a certain feminist in France, but they also got drowned out. And, you know, I mean, I guess my short answer is it's still a very male world, you know. And we do have young, up-and-coming women of color in France, though, that are making their mark, and that would be Marboulou Somoho, who's been writing a lot on Black feminism in France, and I think she'll be an up-and-coming voice, maybe, you know, changing some of the dynamic, the gender dynamic. Shall we go get food? I told my students I would promise that they'd get a cookie before they had to leave at 3:15.